let's talk about how friendships begin. Senga Nengudi and Maren Hassinger met in 1976. They may not remember their first exchange exactly, but Nengudi described her first encounter with Hassinger's sculptures as electric. They first collaborate in 1977. As artists, we know that the line between friend and colleague and collaborator and boss and teacher or student can be a little fuzzy. After all, we're all so many things to one another. And maybe I'm speaking about the fuzzy nature of friendship itself, but I also wonder if maybe fuzzy isn't quite the right word. Maybe I'm looking for something like stretchy or elastic. The way I'm looking at this image of Maren Hassinger, photographed by Senga Nengudi in Nengudi's studio in 1977. And Maren is activating or wearing, or maybe she's worn by Senga's nylon mesh installation. I'm thinking about compression and expansion and presence and give. I mean, look, Maren's hands are on the ground and her feet are in the air, tethered to the wall with these sheer nylon strips, which you can't quite tell in this photo, but they're the color of flesh, as though she's pinched her own skin from her ribs and her thighs and her ankles and strapped her own limbs to the gallery walls. As though she, the young artist Maren Hassinger, is held by and at the same time holding her friend Senga Nengudi's installation as we are held by and hold our friends. In the photo, nylon cradles Maren's body. It holds her tight. And by tight, I mean confined. By tight, I mean corrected. By tight, I mean wrapped, closed, tied, connected, the way a baby is more comfortable in a bundle. Earlier this year, I performed at the Metropolitan Museum, and I know that many of you were there because many of you, well, some of you, are my friends. Some of you saw this performance, and I introduced it this way. I'm gonna quote myself. I said, as I was getting ready today, I was thinking about how there are so many things that are easy to do to others and hard to do to yourself. For example, I said, hugging. I think hugging is one of those things. When I try to hug myself, sometimes it comes out wrong. It comes out, this is what I did. It comes out like this. My arms are crossed in front of me, shielding me from everything and everybody, stopping you from seeing my guts and caging my insides. Whereas what I really want when I give myself a hug is for my arms to stand in for the arms of a friend, for my own embrace to be like someone else's embrace. I can't be the only one, I said, who has imagined life as, for example, a spider, happily surrounded by the silky extensions of my own skinny limbs, like sitting in my own lap. I said, if I were a spider, I would spit hugs, I would shit hugs, I would want for nothing. And I said, actually, last year, getting ready for an exhibition, I wrote a webby kind of note in my journal. It said, I am sticky. I want to bind, to be bound. I'm going to talk today about what it means to be sticky, about what it means to be bound. To bind. A bond. A bind. To bound. A band. A bend. A boundary. A binder. A bandana. This one's my favorite. A husband. To rebound. In bondage. A bomb. To bounce. To busk. To boom. To bond. To be bound. Hey. So I've only been to a real yoga class a few times. I bet that may surprise some of you, my colleagues and friends. But I know that in yoga, instructors use this word bind to describe what happens when we use our bodies to hold our bodies in place. By hooking one foot around the other hip or wrapping one calf around another, I can turn my body into a kind of clasp, an embrace that is also a lock, but with a kind of built-in consent. Maybe it's these two concepts, lock and consent, that together describe the word bind. A bind connects two disparate things in a way that is temporary, or perhaps provisional is a better word. They are connected in such a way that disconnect is not inconceivable, even as it may be undesirable or even impossible to achieve. A bind can be like a tangle. To be in a bind might be to be stuck in a difficulty with no easy way out, perhaps because you yourself have inherited or created the terms that limit you. This is another bit of a digression, but I know you'll forgive me, as you are locked in, so to speak. We don't have a choice. Did anybody else's grandparents get them savings bonds for their birthdays when they were growing up? Yes. I thought that I got $25 to spend on candy, and it turns out instead you have the burden of keeping track of this piece of paper for 20 years so that you can get less candy than you could have gotten before. This connection to your future self, this bond, not a useful one either, given the unreliability of the federal government then and now. Interest was low, let's say. But returning to the bond connecting to distinct and disparate things, the lock, what is the first thing to which we are bound? We might say that our body minds are the first bind. We might describe our relationship with siblings and parents and children and neighbors with whom we share something that can be neither erased nor replaced, only disavowed or disowned as a kind of bind as well. When Senga Nengudi was asked how she, as a choreographer, prepares Maren Hassinger to perform with her sculpture RSVP, the one we just saw on the screen, she said, "I talk about the elements that I'm working with, which would be the elasticity, being sometimes trapped with life's issues." Then we go through improvisational exercises with the piece in preparation for the actual performance. So it's very much getting a relationship with the piece, being part of the piece, seeing what the piece wants you to do, and répondez s'il vous plaît. Being trapped, that's the lock. S'il vous plaît, the if you please, that's the consent. And all of that, everything I just shared, was part one, bound up.
Me?
Oop.
Okay.
I don't think so. Might be at the end.
Okay. Yes. I have it.
Thank you. So, like I said, this is part 2, wound up. A general theory of elasticity. It is tight and loose at the same time. Which also works as a general theory of resilience, which is to say a general theory of rebound, a general theory of return. Senga said, your psyche can stretch, 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 and come back into shape. Resilience as the ability to find once again your shape, as a return to form. The way things are smaller when they're tighter and expand when they're loose. The way the expansion at first seems temporary and over time becomes fixed. The way that even as grown-ups, we continue to grow. Loose and tight are situational. You could be tight in the morning and loose at night. You might be tight when you're cold and loose after you've warmed up. You could be tight at the start of dinner and loose a few drinks in. But this is important. Tight and loose describe capacities, which can be limited or expansive in any passing moment, rather than actions in themselves. So to be tight is not only to be stiff, it's actually to lack the capacity to flex. To be tight is not only to be unyielding, it's to lack the capacity for mobility. Loose and tight also sometimes evoke a quality or capacity of fluency in creative practice. To untighten, to unwind, to loosen up is to create space so the juice can flow through. To reveal what Maren has called the bound up, wound up potential energy of our bodies and our minds. To be tight is also to be intimate. If I say that me and my homie are tight, it means we're close. In his memoir, Turning South Again, literary scholar Houston Baker used the phrase tight spot to describe the physical constraints Black people have been forced to navigate, especially when performing in public. We all know this. It's easy to get into a tight spot, to find yourself in a bind, and it is much harder to get out. And maybe I've gotten ahead of myself. Do we even want to get out? Not always. Sometimes we twist ourselves up on purpose. Sometimes we want to be caught. I'm going to talk for a minute about tightness and discipline and training and their alternatives. It was dance that brought Senga Nengudi and Maren Hassinger together. Maren said of their first phone conversation, "I realized we had both been interested in dance and had a dance background, but I didn't know we had the same dance background." She said, "The guy Senga had been taking classes with, Jimmy Truitt, was in the Lester Horton Company, and Lelia, my teacher, was also in that company. We had the same dance roots." Maren said, "Lester Horton was famous because his was the first interracial company, and he delved heavily into influences from Asia, Mesoamerica, and Native America. He was one of those world artist types of people." This company, choreographer Lester Horton's California-based dance company that Maren is referring to, was indeed one of the first in America to be racially integrated. And those of us who have tried Horton classes, I'm not sure how many in this room that might include. They have really good classes for beginners, absolute beginners for real, at the Ailey School, and I really recommend them if you're feeling adventurous. But those of us who have tried Horton classes know that they feel very satisfyingly technical while remaining a bit more anatomically forgiving than classical ballet. Still, at its most dazzling, Horton technique demands tremendous amounts of physical strength and control. Think, for example, of Alvin Ailey's Revelations, which integrates Horton-inspired movements, the tilts, vertical lines, the hinges, flat backs. All these planes produce dynamic, muscular, sculptural energy. And there's something in Hassinger's work in which materials like wire, rope, resemble the shape of flowing water that is simultaneously stiff and organic. The way, for example, the Fibonacci pattern of a fern can feel simultaneously rigid and infinite. Meticulous and generous, the way a really good parent might be meticulous yet generous with a young child, fluid and rigorous at the same time, flowing and fixed at the same time. And Maren explicitly linked her sculptural practice to this foundation in dance. She said, "I was never part of a dance company until Senga and I started working together." She said, "Then we became the dancers that we always wanted to be but couldn't." And it really affected the work that we make still. She said, "Senga's work grew out of her body, changing, and my work grew out of motion, you know? My pieces like Leaning, which MoMA acquired, Whirling, which is in the collection of the Morgan State University Museum, and Walking, acquired by the Williams College Museum of Art, were all wire sculptures that were made about movement. They were below knee level and intended to be like feet and legs moving in space." So when I think about Maren's work, I think about tension and resistance and gravity and weight. And when I think of Senga's work, I think the same thing. For example, in the RSVP sculptures, I've often thought that Maren looks as if she is pulled from above and pulling from below. I think about how sometimes we are weighted down and sometimes we're held aloft, and sometimes we are held together. As Senga once shared, she said, and I quote, "From tender, tight beginnings to sagging end." Sag, from a late 14th century word that means to hang down unevenly. In Middle English, to sink, to be mired down, possibly from a German word meaning to settle, as in dregs of wine. To droop, especially in the middle, as from weight or pressure. Sink, from an old English word that means to become submerged, to go under, to subside. To force or drag gradually downward, to go in, to penetrate, to make a penetrating impression, as in the phrase sink in. to be reduced to a lower or worse state, to fall or fail as from weakness or a heavy blow. To decrease, to be reduced in value, to set, as in the sun or moon, contrasted with swim as early as the 14th century. I think of the way laundry sags on a line, the way even underwear floats freely in the air. In an interview, Black feminist scholar Hortense Spillers said, quote, "Some of this stuff I don't think the ancestors would bless at all. They wouldn't like airing dirty laundry, but I think dirty laundry is precisely what you air. You just let it all hang out. I believe that doing so frees everybody up." Maren Hassinger's wire rope sculptures, like her sculpture Interlock from 1972, which is hung from a hook, and in which the two frazzled ends loosen toward and through each other, show fraying as a form that lets it all hang out. Fraying as a form of freeing. That was part 2. And this is the 3rd part. This is a poem by Senga Nengudi. Me being, is not an action verb. I'll read it again. Me being is not an action verb. So this part, this 3rd part, is called me, being me, being me, being me, being me, being me. Hortense Spillers, who I mentioned just now, defines each precious, indivisible life as a one. She says the one is the small integrity of the now that accumulates the tense of the presence as proofs of the past and as experience that would warrant, might earn the future. She invokes Jean-Paul Sartre. What I constantly aim at across my experiences, she says, are the other's feelings, the other's ideas, the other's volitions, the other's character. This is because the other is not only the one whom I see, but the one who sees me. Finally, in my essential being, I depend on the essential being of the other. And Spiller says, instead of holding that my being for myself is opposed to my being for others, I find that being for others appears as a necessary condition for my being for myself. To be for yourself, you must be for others. To be for others, you must be for yourself. This is not an opposition, but a mutual dependence. This is co-respondence. Ooh. Okay. Okay. The best part. Okay, I want to talk more about what it means to be for others, to be for yourself, and to respond. So, for example, now we have the great pleasure of watching Leslie move improvisationally. When using improvisation as a practice of composition, for example, in dance, you quickly learn that your first step is to devise a set of usable constraints. These constraints can be built in as in the limitations and opportunities produced by this thing that we're working within, this web. But another example of a built-in constraint could be the limit of your own range of motion, like how high your leg can go. Another constraint might come from your training, the limits of what you know how to do. And other constraints might be entirely artificial, like the choice to keep your arms completely straight, or to imitate the geometry that you see around you, or to repeat the movements you performed before, but on a different plane. And the magic, we know, happens precisely in this friction between fluidity and restriction. To generate your own limits for yourself, to create your own rules. This is always already a response. What do I mean by response? I'm not talking about a response to a call. So often no one has asked for what we generously, gratuitously offer. I'm not speaking of a passive and automatic reaction like an echo. I suggest instead that an approach to response might be to consider affirmation as a foundation or a starting point. To respond is to allow yourself to be moved by another and other in an act of co-composition. A response is a kind of voluntary entanglement with another. And speaking about response, that I'm not speaking of a passive and automatic reaction like an echo, but instead an approach to response that's rooted in affirmation. To respond is to allow yourself to be moved by another in an act of co-composition. A response is a kind of voluntary entanglement with another. To enter a space of mutual trust, to enter a space of mutual responsibility. A response is always an invitation. A response leans toward the horizon of the co-respondence it conjures. Senga says, and I quote, "Sort of like when you're doing a dance, you have your partner, and you are guided by your partner. The partner puts their hand on your back, and they guide you." Senga said, that's kind of what I'm looking for, that each one responds to the other. From that, something even bigger happens. Hortense Spillers writes, the goal is to try to open the way to responsible freedom. In the simplest possible definition, responsible means something simply like committed to responding. For Spillers, responsible freedom relies on affirmative and exploratory entanglements rather than forced allegiances. Responsible freedom is freedom with rather than freedom from one another. Responsible freedom is mutual promise grounded in mutual trust. Responsibility is a form of voluntary intimacy. Some spiders are social, spinning shared webs. I have read that these webs can be as large as a football field. Sometimes, though, they're smaller. Sometimes they're just big enough for two. To conjure a web in which two of us together choose to be caught. I'm going to close with a little quotation from Senga. She says, "Palm to palm, arm to arm, toe to toe, back to back, dos a do. Thanks so much for coming. We did it.